Hi. Okay. The War Against Women by Marilyn French. Part 1. Continue. Most analysts of 19th and early 20th century fundamentalism have concluded that it was not a political movement because it dealt only with personal ethics. Like political commentators today who dismiss feminism as a political movement, even as feminist novels pour from the presses, male critics deplore the dearth of political novels in our age. Male analysts of fundamentalism ignore its major agenda, female subordination, and separate spheres of activity. A thoroughly political agenda, Duberg remarks. Analysts of the fundamentalism resuscitated in the 1970s as a major political and social force continue to censor this agenda. The few who note fundamentalist opposition to the women's movement, abortion and divorce, believe this is a new theme. George Marsden wrote that their alliance with the Roman Catholic Church on gender issues was new, and Douglas Frank, who praised the new fundamentalists for focusing on homosexuality and the Equal Rights Amendment, believed these concerns were innovative. But they are as old as fundamentalism itself. The same men who are blind and deaf to feminism are acutely sensitive to what threatens their dominance and privilege. One of these of their responses, oh my gosh. Should I start over? Okay, whatever. Is to join fundamentalist sects. Another is to ally with them. As Reagan, Bush, and other conservative politicians have done. The new fundamentalists are extremely vocal and have increasingly entered the political realm in the past 2 decades, violating their own rule of segregation. Nancy Ammerman analyzed strict fundamentalists and found their main characteristic to be rigid separatism. Out of an intense desire to avoid compromise and accommodation, each sect holds itself separate from all others and from political parties. The only faction that does not demand strict separatism swelled to a majority in the Southern Baptist Convention in the 1970s and 80s, and now dominates the fundamentalist movement. Militant biblicist conservatives, they uphold separatism but justify their engagement in political activism by their desire to reform society. The leading exponent in the 1970s, Jerry Falwell, founded the Moral Majority, a self-described special interest group linking millions of Americans who shared the same moral values and wanted to influence government. Falwell explains what triggered his activism. Back in the 60s, I was criticizing pastors who were taking time out of their pulpit to involve themselves in the civil rights movement or any other political venture. I said, "You're wasting your time from what you're called to do." Now I find myself doing the same thing, and for the same reasons they did. Things began to happen. The invasion of humanism into the public school system began to alarm us back in the 60s. Then the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision of 1973 and abortion on demand shook me up. Then, adding to that gradual regulation of various things, it became very apparent the federal government was going in the wrong direction, and if allowed, would be harassing non-public schools, of which I have one of 16,000 right now. So step by step, we became convinced that we must get involved if we're going to continue what we're doing. This engaged fundamentalist sect transmuted into the Moral Majority, which transmuted into the extreme right wing in American politics. Whether as the new right, the radical religious right, or the new conservatism, it has become enormously powerful and has abandoned the position articulated by Falwell of wanting to influence government, aiming now to control it. It helped defeat the Equal Rights Amendment and has removed many liberals from office. It works to criminalize abortion, censor liberal ideas in the media and public education, and introduced pro-family laws. Most of its efforts in the last decade have been unsuccessful, but its propaganda and support contributed to the elections of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and the swing to the right of the American electorate in general. At the same time the electorate moved right, a pronounced gender gap appeared. The new right rhetoric of morality masks its real agenda, to re-legitimate and reimpose subordination on the working class, people of color, and women. A majority of blacks and women oppose it, but many white working class men support it, men whose own interests it actually threatens, who have nothing to gain but their spurious superiority over blacks and women. Sheila Ruth points out that beneath the rhetoric of family values, patriotism, and the American way, fundamentalists are trying to revoke fundamental principles of American government, separation of church and state, First Amendment rights, the political party system. She quotes some of their major spokesmen. "We've already taken control of the conservative movement, and conservatives have taken control of the Republican Party. The remaining thing is to see if we can take control of the country." Richard Viguerie, major fundraiser and strategist, Religious New Right. Groups like ours are potentially very dangerous to the political process. A group like ours could lie through its teeth and the candidate it helps stays clean. Terry Dolan, Chairman, National Political Action Committee. We're radicals working to overturn the recent structure in this country. We're talking about Christianizing America. Paul Weyrich, Director, Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress. The fundamentalist movement jettisoned its religious image for a political one that claims to be pro-life but supports tough foreign policy and opposes gun control laws. Though pro-Israel because of belief in millenarianism, it is anti-Semitic. Professing to hold the family sacred, it opposes AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, shelters for beaten women, and child abuse legislation. Ultra-nationalistic, militaristic, authoritarian, racist, sexist, driven by a mystical principle of mission, requiring absolute devotion, Ruth writes. The movement has the shape of fascism, American style. The new right grew even stronger during the 1980s, as conservative judges named to the Supreme Court effectively halted affirmative action programs and modified reproductive rights. Grassroots activists intimidate educational institutions by attacking curricular material, sometimes burning or banning them. The movement is very rich and can support right-wing journals attached in fact or by association to major universities, some of which publish viciously bigoted material, and organizations like Accuracy in Academia, which seeks out and attacks secular humanism in universities. The new right has succeeded in diverting funds from pro-female to pro-family agencies, cutting bank funds for social programs and increasing those of the military. Besides First Amendment rights, it threatens the rights to privacy, sexual freedom, and perhaps all civil rights in the United States. The leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention has become too extreme even for some conservative members, many of whom began to separate from it after it dismissed 2 editors of its news service, upheld a ban on financial support to churches with female pastors, and destroyed a history of its Sunday school board that the leaders themselves had commissioned. In May 1991, this less conservative wing, comprising about 6,000 Southern Baptists, set up a new organization, the Cooperative Baptist Convention. They rejected a literal reading of the Bible and accept the ordination of women. The Southern Baptist Convention incited the movement, led by Senator Jesse Helms, to coerce artists receiving grants from the National Endowment for the Arts to pledge not to create obscene work. Although no one can define obscene, even the Supreme Court makes it a matter of local sensibility, and such a pledge violates the First Amendment to the Constitution. The SBC backs or fosters any number of agencies besides accuracy in academia, among them the Coalition on Revival, which is agitating to transform the United States into a fundamentalist Christian state. The Reverend Don Wildman, who triggered the NEA censorship campaign, is a major figure in COR, working to abolish public schools, the IRS, and the Federal Reserve System, among other things, by the year 2000. Indeed, a strong faction within COR, Reconstructionism, seeks to impose biblical law on American society to establish what it calls the Kingdom of God. Its head, R.J. Rushdoony, wants to execute, preferably by stoning, homosexuals, adulterers, astrologers, blasphemers, and incorrigible children. The leader of COR, Dr. J. Grimstead, who describes himself as less extreme than Rushdoony, wants boys trained as warriors in Christian Green Beret boot camps. COR's strategy, Grimstead explains, is to take over city councils and school boards and elect sheriffs and county officials. Once in power, it will establish county militias to wage spiritual wars, the first against communist Mexico. COR urges members to run for office as Christians without acknowledging their connection to COR or their real agenda. In this way, a COR candidate recently won election to the City Council of Gilroy, California, a woman, Sarah C. Nelson. Women are not immune to the fundamentalist message, and the extreme right often places them in visible positions, usually in movements aimed at impeding or revoking women's rights. Islam. Movements with similar agendas have emerged in Catholicism, Judaism, and Islam. A Black Islamic movement founded in America by Elijah Muhammad, shouts out to him, now called the Nation of Islam, is led by Louis Farrakhan. The movement, too, is primarily defensive. Like fundamentalists, blacks feel assaulted by American society. But Black Americans are persecuted. Fundamentalists are not. White male Protestants believe their prerogatives are being eroded by economic policies, feminism, and civil rights laws. Blacks are singled out for prosecution for acts performed with impunity by whites. Anywhere in the United States, Black males are regularly stopped and even arrested simply for walking or driving in white neighborhoods. They may be beaten, sometimes they are killed. The percentage of Black men in prison in America is shockingly larger than in apartheid South Africa. A Black male has a 1 in 3 chance of being imprisoned before he reaches 21. Whites' unremitting drive to persecute African Americans is reflected in the number of prosecutions of Black political leaders, which is especially striking given their low number in the population and the corruption of white political leaders. A double standard is applied to cultural figures too. Adolph Reed Jr. notes that while Black music group Public Enemy is publicly censured for racism and misogyny, white heavy metal Guns N' Roses offers unremitting, unapologetic misogyny, homophobia, racism, and xenophobia. Black rap group Two Live Crew is put on trial for obscenity, but the bigoted and violently women-hating Andrew Dice Clay is given television specials and film contracts. I would add that Black Mayor Marion Barry was prosecuted for taking drugs by white men who coerced a Black woman into betraying him, while important white men in the Reagan administration either escaped prosecution or were punished lightly for subverting the Constitution by selling arms and importing drugs to support a private war against tiny, impoverished Nicaragua. Rich white men are lightly punished or will escape punishment for swindling the public of billions of dollars through savings and loan manipulations. This intense scrutiny of Blacks who rise to political or social leadership, this need to cut them down, added to the pervasive, systematic discrimination imposed on African Americans, amounts to almost a genocidal policy. A militant response to it is understandable. It is understandable that Farrakhan should be racist, admirable that he offers racial pride to replace racial shame. Is he racist? What is not understandable is the rest of his ideology. He does not attack systemic discrimination, poverty, ghettoization, exploitation, but black social pathology, a slave mentality that leads to crime and drugs. Farrakhan claims blacks as a people are sick. In this, he echoes white fundamentalists who, despite their designs on the state, are most concerned with private life, the family structure. Jews contributed enormously to the 1960s civil rights movement and were never part of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Yet Farrakhan is anti-Semitic. Why? And he unabashedly favors male supremacy and female subordination in accordance with the laws of Islam. Reed, who, like male analysts of Protestant fundamentalism, pays little attention to Farrakhan's insistence on male domination, merely noting it, writes that Farrakhan uses a militant, radical style to promote bootstrap capitalism and private individual responses to social problems that cannot be solved individually. Farrakhan's program is familiar: private virtue, hard work and discipline, male authority, racial essentialism. If he were white, he might add to this list the training of black boys into warriors in black Green Beret camps. Being black, he would likely be killed for such a message. Like other black leaders of both nonviolent and militant movements in the United States. But the ideas are the same, whoever espouses them. Militancy, competitiveness, a contempt for victims, even if one's own group is among them, because victims are feminine, like Jews in 19th century ideologies. Virtue is a private affair, but private virtue means female virtue, defined and enforced by male dominance of the sacrosanct family. Militant Islamic movements, called Muslim Brotherhoods, the Western press calls them Muslim fundamentalists, are more explicitly women-hating than African American Muslims. Men form these brotherhoods in response to real economic and social ills in their societies, many of which have been impoverished by centuries of colonial rule. Leaders thought industrial development would ease some of these ills, but as always, it brought terrible dislocations. Crowded cities with their inevitable social problems and changed work arrangements in families. The problems of industrialization revived colonial resentment of white policies and customs, the main target of the Muslim Brotherhoods. Like Mussolini and Hitler and a host of less successful leaders, they believe that the past was pure and happier and can be revived in the present. In Muslim countries, many men see militant Islam as the only nationalistic movement, the only alternative to westernization. And for many in the Middle East, westernization means the results of development. Wealth and privileges for a few, but also high unemployment, urban unrest, and a change never publicly claimed as a motive, more independence for women, which is in fact the most threatening. The Muslim Brotherhoods direct most of their animus at women, as if women caused the present problems and changes in their behavior could solve them. No party runs on a blatantly anti-women platform, but everyone knows the tacit agenda of the Brotherhoods is to force women in Western dress back into the veil and out of the workforce. No overview of the Muslim Brotherhoods has yet been written, but wherever they exist, they are fiercely nationalist and religious, anti-modern, eager to fight religious war, and all concentrate obsessively on women. We will focus on the militant movements in various Muslim countries. Iran. Many Iranian women oppose the Shah's autocratic rule and his use of a cruel secret police, SAVAK, which tortured many women who joined underground anti-government guerrilla groups. In 1978, militant Muslim supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini incited massive demonstrations against the Shah. To placate the religious leaders of the revolutionary movement, he banned abortion. But in 1979, the militants drove him out. Khomeini, who had been propagandizing from exile in Paris, returned to Iran in triumph. In March 1979, 100,000 women gathered at the University of Tehran to celebrate the overthrow of the Shah and the Ayatollah's victory. But almost at once, Khomeini suspended reform family laws, barred women from becoming judges, issued his first order on the veil, passed a series of laws to segregate schools, buses, beaches, and other public areas, and established theocratic rule. Disregarding women's support, the Ayatollah abolished all laws granting women rights and showed no reluctance to kill women who upheld them. He established a morals police, made up of, in a rare exception, of women, called the Zainab sisters, to exercise surveillance on women's dress and behavior and harass or arrest them. One of his first acts was to prosecute the first woman member of the Iranian cabinet, Farrokhru Parsa. Tried by judges in hoods, allowed no defense attorney and no appeal, she was in fact declared guilty before the trial began. Parsa was charged, writes Manaz Afjami, with expansion of prostitution, corruption on earth, and warring against God. Her actual offenses were to direct schoolgirls not to veil, and to establish a commission to revise textbooks to present a non-sexist image of women. In December 1979, Khomeini had Parsa executed. She was wrapped in a sack and machine-gunned. Women protested the new rules in massive marches in Tehran and other Iranian cities. Men beat, stoned, and even stabbed them as they marched. Men purged women from the public realm, then passed laws severely restricting them from taking jobs and making it almost impossible for them to talk to or deal with men at work. In 1981, Khomeini had 50 schoolgirls shot and thousands of girls and women arrested for counter-revolutionary or anti-Islamic activity. None were given trials, and reports indicate that 20,000 women, including pregnant women, old women, and young girls, were executed. In 1979, Khomeini set the legal minimum age for execution at 10 years, or puberty, for girls, and 16 for boys, banned women from most sports events, and launched a new campaign of arrest, executing 15,000 people. This same year, he intensified government persecution of religious minorities, especially Jews and Baha'is. In 1983, he made veiling compulsory for women and had 10 women hanged for refusing to convert from Baha'i to Islam. 3 were teenagers. Others included the first Iranian woman physicist, a concert pianist, the former personnel director for Iran Television, and a nurse. He recruited children to clear minefields during Iran's war against Iraq. Hundreds of thousands were killed. In 1989, a woman interviewed on a television program said she would rather model herself on a contemporary woman than on Muhammad's daughter, the self-sacrificing Fatima, who has been held up as a model for women for 1,300 years. Ayatollah Khomeini ordered those responsible for the program arrested and executed. When his advisors assured him the producers had made an innocent mistake, he granted pardons, but by then Iranian women had surely gotten the message. Algeria. The success of militant Islam in Iran spurred on groups in other countries. Neither Algeria nor Jordan has ever been a militantly Islamic state, but as economic pressures can cause hardship and their governments impose austerity measures, Muslim brotherhoods gain adherents by blaming the hard times on Western influence and women taking men's jobs and adopting Western dress and habits, So do the men. Algeria's problems were not solved by independence from France, and the industrialization introduced by President Houari Boumediene produced urbanization, unemployment, and economic crisis. Some Algerians had already begun to call for a return to the old pure Islam when the 1978 Muslim Revolution in Iran inspired a young British educated graduate in physics to form a Muslim Brotherhood. They demanded women be segregated from men and forbidden to work or travel without escorts. Militants prowled the streets, targeting young women in Western clothes, and threw acid at them. Blinding one, they stabbed boys who tried to help them. Operating underground, they spread fear among women everywhere. Peter R. Naus reports that the Algerian police marked their files in red ink as if for a crime that a woman but not a man had divorced. Morals police spied on women and charged them with prostitution if they were found alone in a cafe, renting a hotel room at the beach, or if they went out with more than 2 men. Women seen with foreigners after dark could be questioned, even beaten. Kissing in public was forbidden, and women were held responsible for it. I don't care. Okay. More women wore veils to placate men and to protect themselves from them. The government tried to undermine the Muslim Brotherhood by allying with Orthodox Muslim clergy, and tried to placate the clergy by naming them to a committee to reform the family code, which at the time mingled Sharia, Islamic law, and French colonial law. No women were named to the revision committee. They protested but were ignored. During debate over the code, one legislator proposed specifying the length of the stick a husband may use to beat his wife. In January 1981, the government forbade women to leave the country. When women denounced such revolting discrimination, the Minister of the Interior asserted that no such decree existed. The women managed to get a draft of the revised family code and found that it returned them to the legal status of minors. In September 1981, the Council of Ministers accepted the revision. In October, women held major demonstrations in Algiers with a lawyers' collective, labor union representatives, and former freedom fighters. They launched a national campaign, obtaining 10,000 signatures on a petition opposing the code, tacitly comparing the Algerian government to the former French colonial regime. They paraded heroines of the War of Independence, whose presence forced the police to avoid brutality. They filmed their protest and declared their demands: monogamy, an unconditional right of women to work, equal inheritance rights, identical ages at marriage, identical divorce conditions, and the best possible protection for abandoned children. It was never broadcast. The government withdrew the code and did not resubmit it until June 1984, but the new version was worse than the earlier one. It gave husbands the right to divorce wives for almost any reason and eject them from the family home. Divorce by mutual consent was eliminated, as was the right of a divorced wife to demand housing from her former husband unless she had custody of the children. Both permitted polygyny, but the 1981 version had maintained the Sharia condition that a man had to provide separate houses for each wife and allowed a woman to exclude polygyny in her marriage contract. These conditions were eliminated in the 1984 version. The 1984 Family Code confines women in the family, as in a cell, to protect and preserve them from social ills. requires a husband to support his wife. In return, he may marry more than one woman, if he can justify his action. I guess I should tell you where all the quotes are. Wives who object are allowed to divorce. A man may marry by proxy and divorce at will. A woman may divorce only under specific conditions, or can pay her husband to grant her a divorce. Women are required to obey husbands, respect their in-laws, and breastfeed their children if they can. Some provisions remain the same. Muslim men, but not women, may marry outside the faith, and children must be raised up in the father's religion. Marriage is arranged, but the man gives the woman a dowry which she keeps if he dies or repudiates her. A father may restrain a daughter from any marriage he considers not in her interest. Boys reach independence at 18, girls at marriage, when they fall under a husband's domination. The single improvement was that the minimum age of marriage was raised from 16 to 18 for females, and from 18 to 21 for males. The code satisfied the Orthodox clergy, but not the Muslim Brotherhood, who took it as a sign that persistence would be rewarded by more power. They incited student members to riot and attack progressive students with axes and bicycle chains, killing one, wounding several. Some of the militants were arrested, but they had read the political climate accurately. After initially suppressing the Brotherhood, the government, initiating a policy of greater democracy, gave it the status of a political party, the Islamic Front of Salvation, FIS. The FIS demands that an Islamic ethic be imposed that bans Western secular customs. This ethic focuses almost completely on women. The militants insist women wear a hijab, a raincoat-like garment, ankle length with a scarf completely covering the hair. Some press women to give up their jobs. They demand that the government continue to ban birth control information, contraceptives, and daycare. Government legitimation of militancy encourages men to treat women high-handedly. In 1980, in the city of Mascara, a Muslim man, outraged that his sister, a nurse, treated male patients, doused her with alcohol and set her on fire. Although the Women's Association is a government mouthpiece, Algerian women are trying to organize and fight for rights. But men increasingly support the FIS, which in June 1990 received almost 65% of the popular vote. 40% of the population did not vote at all, and over 60%, mostly women, are illiterate. It is now working to prohibit women from working outside the home. One woman said, "Algeria's 500,000 working women are not going to march to the slaughterhouse silently, even if it means a civil war." A civil war of women against men? Question mark. Egypt. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Nasser granted women the vote, legitimating their existence as citizens. After oil prices increased in the early 1970s, President Anwar Sadat let men travel to the oil-producing states on the Persian Gulf to find jobs. Women left behind took on the responsibilities of handling the money their husbands sent home, hiring workers, and deciding local issues. Middle-class women increasingly entered the workforce. Poor families migrated to cities to find work, forcing rural women to find new ways to bring money into the household. Many sold small goods or food on the street, a public space. Islamic militants were enraged at women's new role and for entering public space. A female leader of the Wafd Party explains that militant Muslim men believe women have no right to occupy public space and should be at home with their children. Women's place is not in public life, not to be seen, but to be a spectator. The Secretary General of the National Council for Childhood and Motherhood adds, if there's unemployment, the militants say, it's because women are taking jobs. If there's delinquency, it's because women are leaving the home to work. If there's no room on the buses, it's because women are filling them on their way to work. Men, angry at women for appearing in public, commonly molest them on public transport. The problem becomes so severe that authorities in Cairo establish segregated railway cars in the rapid transit system. Some opposed establishing a harem on wheels, arguing that women would not use them, but they have become very popular. Women use segregated cars to escape unremitting sexual harassment by men. The police find it necessary to enforce the rule. Men often insist on entering the segregated car, which is sometimes less crowded than the others. But harassment on the metro is not as severe as on the buses, which are cheaper and not segregated. The militants have also worked to increase the authority of men who use purdah structures to hinder women's advancement and keep them out of the public realm. In 1985, the Egyptian Supreme Court struck down a 1979 law giving women the right to divorce husbands who take second wives. In 1987, the government altered its electoral practice to reduce the number of seats designated for women in the 448-member legislature from 33 to 18, and brought women's political organizations under official control, stifling the growth of an independent women's movement. Afghanistan, Pakistan. When the Soviet Union swallowed Afghanistan within its sphere of influence, it demanded that the Afghans educate women and allow them to participate in local town hall meetings. The Afghans resisted Soviet pressure in all areas, but especially on women's rights, and in 1979 the Soviets invaded the country and installed a puppet government in Kabul. The Afghans rebelled and war broke out. The Soviet Union supplied and supported the Kabul government, and the United States and other Western nations armed the Mujahideen guerrillas. Afghan women were caught in a no-win situation between supporting their men and the possibility of personal liberation under a Soviet aegis. As women and workers tend to do, most sided with the nationalist cause despite Afghanistan's prejudicial laws. School children, led by a girl, Nahid, demonstrated against the new government, chanting slogans and throwing bricks. Government soldiers killed 70 of them. Nahid became an instant heroine, and Afghan women thronged almost universally to the rebels. Demonstrating almost daily, they formed the Afghanistan Women's Revolutionary League to organize girls and women into the resistance. A league leader, Farida Ahmadi, was imprisoned and tortured in 1981, but escaped. In 1983, the puppet government released all female and some male prisoners of the nearly 100,000 incarcerated. In 1989, the Soviet Union, near bankruptcy and worn out, left Afghanistan, but the Russian-backed government still stands. It clearly has some popular support. The rebels, the Mujahideen, who continually squabble amongst themselves, are united only on one issue: militant Islam, which mainly means sending women back to their bags, the burqa, a head-to-toe shroud. The government tries to gain points with Muslims by renovating mosques and prefacing its proclamations with invocations to Allah. It also hints ominously about the policies of any Mujahideen government, especially toward women. Although Afghan women supported them in protesting the Soviet invasion, the Mujahideen want not only to force them back into the burqa, but to eliminate female education and expel from wage work the 250,000 employed urban women and the 80% of rural women who work in the fields. The UN estimates that 3 million refugees fled Afghanistan between 1979 and 1984. Those in Pakistan. Many in the border city of Peshawar are under Mujahideen control. The Mujahideen strictly confines female refugees to their houses or tents and forbids them to take advantage of the medical care and education offered by international agencies. In June 1990, 80 mullahs from all 7 Mujahideen parties issued a fatwa, religious ruling, posting it through the Peshawar. It ordered women not to wear perfume, noisy bangles, or close-fitting decorative or masculine clothing. They must cover their bodies with veils at all times, and clothes must not be made of fabric that rustles. Women may not walk in the middle of the street, swing their hips, or talk, laugh, or joke with strangers or foreigners. They may not attend school, even Muslim schools. If such knowledge is necessary, it is better that women learn from cassette tapes, the fatwa advises. And it is unnecessary for women to go out to work. Men will provide for them, although thousands of men have been killed in the war. Mujahideen gangs in Peshawar harass Afghan women who work with foreign relief agencies, one of the few employers in the area, intimidating female doctors, teachers, and nutritionists. They distribute pamphlets signed Protectors of Islamic Purity, or Afghan Islamic Youth. One charged that 50 Western Christian women with AIDS had been sent to work on projects in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In fact, the guerrillas. They send threatening night letters to working women, warning against Western influence. They make threatening telephone calls. They sent an envelope to one woman's office containing 5 bullets and a note informing her one was for her and others for her colleagues. These men wrecked a school for Afghan girls run by the Pakistani government, and in April 1990, a Muslim cleric instigated 5,000 Afghan refugees to destroy a women's center. Run by an Australian religious charity, Shelter Now, the center offered lessons in sewing and gardening and a child care facility to widows of Afghan men killed in the war. The men claimed it gave the women birth control pills and Bibles and allowed them to relax, to sit on the children's swings outside the center and use its bathroom and soap. The women who ran the center and those who used it adamantly denied that birth controls or pills or Bibles had been handed out. A group of armed men shot at the male director of Shelter Now in his car. Many of the women have quit their jobs in terror. Others travel with armed bodyguards. One teacher changes her clothes several times a day to confuse men following her. The Mujahideen have disappeared over a dozen Afghan women who worked in women's centers or for foreign aid organizations. The United States continues at this writing, May 1991, to send aid, including arms, to these same Mujahideen. Jordan. In Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood won almost half the seats in parliament in the 1989 election and was effective in defeating all female candidates. The 1989 election was the first general election since women won the right to vote in 1974, and the first in which they ran for office. 13 women were courageous enough to do so. The Brotherhood targeted all of them, but especially Chujan Faisal, who had written in an article for an Amman newspaper that the Quran grants equal rights to men and women. For this sin, the Brotherhood tried to have her declared mentally incompetent, annul her marriage, and exonerated, before the fact, anyone who killed her. Some political commentators blamed women themselves for losing, arguing they should have presented themselves as advocates for everyone, not just women. But Faisal explained, "I am fighting for human rights, and when you fight for human rights, you find yourself often fighting for the rights of women and children." Jordanian women are highly influenced by men and vote as they are told. The ballot is a secret, but some men may have punished their wives if any woman candidate had won. Judaism. When the term fundamentalism is applied to Judaism, it refers to the new political prominence of religion in Israel, especially of two Orthodox groups, one nationalist, Gush Emunim, one anti-nationalist, Agudat Israel. Leon Wieseltier believes the term really denotes a change in the relationship of religion to politics in Israel, because of a great reaction to what some people consider the excesses and exaggerations of the separation of religion from politics. Approving of religion's impact on politics, he scorns the Labour Party's shallow, socialist, anti-clerical notion of the place of religion in human affairs. Many people might approve the intrusion of religion into politics if religions offered a different message from political bodies, turning their adherents toward elements other than power, reverence for nature and living beings, human needs for affection, cooperation, and toleration, respect for the unquantifiable in human experience. But the new militant sects are totally concerned with power and obsessed with subordinating women. Not only do they not urge affection, cooperation, toleration, and a reverence for the non-material aspects of life, but their demands for female subordination are made in hatred. Some militant sects have a nationalist content, but for them even national autonomy seems to require total female subordination. So assured, so certain are they of their rightness, that no one questions the connection among these elements. Why must women be subordinate for a nation to define its own character, for virtue to exist? Israel was founded with the dream of creating an egalitarian socialist state, and the young people who thronged to the early kibbutzim hoped to build lives that combined work on the land with work of the mind and imagination, subsistence and culture fostered in small, sharing, familial communities. And this dream was realized on many kibbutzim up to a point. Gradually, men shunted women to kitchens, laundries, and nurseries. Gradually, men pressured women to sit silent as men took over leadership. Many women left, and many of those I met during a brief visit live in the kibbutzim feeling powerless and oppressed. The strength, individuality, energy, and assertiveness of many Israeli women obscures the fact that they live in a country whose laws governing women are almost as repressive as those of Muslim states. The global prominence of Golda Meir as Prime Minister of Israel obscures the fact that she was one of only 10 women in the 120-member Knesset, the only woman ever to hold a cabinet position, and no friend to women. Israel's founders established Jewish law, as repressive of women as any other ancient law, but for decades Israelis gave the Labour Party a majority, in accord with their socialist ideals. But Labour never won a large enough majority to set up a government without the support of the National Religious Party. These two parties dominated Israeli politics even before the state was founded. The importance of the religious right, which has always been extremely conservative, to a predominantly secular socialist state is puzzling, especially since many Jews are not religious. The reason for its importance may be the problem of determining Jewishness. Jewishness is not a discrete quality. No ethnic or racial category is discrete. People who are citizens of Italy and speak Italian call themselves Italian, even if some of their ancestors came from outside Italy. Citizens of the United States are called Americans, although most possess mixed ethnic backgrounds. Certain human qualities are genetically discrete. The world's 4 major races exhibit different skin colors, hair type, and sometimes eye shape or other variable. Race is detectable through analysis of blood, but racial intermarriage over generations modifies and can eradicate the signs of racial ancestry. Jews do not constitute a race, nor do Jews have a common remembered homeland. Even when they did, the ancient kingdom was constantly contested by native groups and invaders like the Philistines or Palestinians. Jews who would not submit to foreign invaders were transported as slaves, killed, or dispersed. Yet they did not vanish as a coherent group to become assimilated into alien populations like other ancient peoples. What held them together as self-conscious Jews in their wanderings across the globe was religion. Despite surely many defections and additions, enough Jews conformed to a religion with a strict written law to maintain group identity. The touchstone of Jewishness, having a Jewish mother, harks back to a time before the law, when people were unaware of men's contribution to procreation. But what makes one's mother Jewish? Only consciousness of belonging to the Jewish community. Without a remembered common homeland or a common language, Jews have no defining characteristics except religion. But religious practice or belief does not make one a Jew. Many Jews are not religious, yet Jews absolutely needed to establish a Jewish homeland after millennia of persecution in the most horrifying event of a horrifying century, the Holocaust. A homeland for Jews should be open to all Jews, but Jews, fearing the lesson of history, want to limit citizenship to Jews. Their problem then was defining a Jew. Since religion held the people together over the ages, it is religion that provides coherent Jewish identity. So the Jewish state grants enormous moral weight to its tiny, ultra-Orthodox party, which does not even support the Jewish state, refuses to serve in its army, and continues to uphold the law laid down in the Torah. But the law laid down in the Torah was intended to order a society that had vanished even before Christianity and Islam emerged. The Jewish religious law that governs family relations in Israel, the Halacha, was last amended in the 11th century. Like older Hindu law, it was intended to expand male dominance and make patriarchal ideas a standard. The driving force of fundamentalist religious movements is not to rediscover an intuition of divinity, but to reassert patriarchy, the ideology that has brought the world to its present calamitous pass. These movements identify religion with law rather than spirit. Their aims are not religious, but political. Their motive is not to seek holiness, but to avenge the loss of a specious superiority. Since Israel began as a religious state, its laws have always discriminated against women. In 1948, President David Ben-Gurion told women they could best serve the state by bearing at least 4 children, and what he called Aliyah Penimet, internal immigration. 25 years later, Aliyah Penimit determined public policy which banned abortion unless pregnancy or childbirth threatened a woman's life, and even the dissemination of birth control information. The government offered economic incentives to encourage large families and exempted married women from military service. Moral standards have not changed since ancient times. The ancient Hebrew word for prostitute meant she who goes out of doors. Today, the rabbis still insist, Kavod bat melech penima, honorable women remain indoors. Even before the militant Judaic movement emerged, Israel oppressed women, as we can see in men's response to Jewish feminists. Trying to found a shelter for battered wives, rape victims, girls beaten or raped by male relatives, runaways who here as elsewhere had little recourse but prostitution, feminist Marcia Friedman discovered that although £2 billion a year was allocated to the youth division of the welfare ministry, only £1 million, 0.05%, or 1/20th of 1%, went to distressed girls. The rest went to Noar B'Mtzuka, boys in distress. Only one ministry staff member and 7 social workers were assigned to help teenage girls, although the ministry underestimating, as government agencies often do, that 20,000 girls needed help. The Defense Ministry knew that every year 25% of teenage Israeli girls were rejected by the army for not having completed 8 grades of school. Their male counterparts were taken into the army, placed in remedial programs, and educated. The girls were not. A quarter of Israel's prostitutes were between 14 and 18. Strenuous efforts led to an increase in the budget for distressed girls, from £1 to £7 million, 0.35%, or 7/20th of 1%. Israeli marriage and divorce are under the jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts, presided over by the ultra-Orthodox who follow the Halacha. Thus, only husbands can initiate divorce, only men can bear witness, and all the judges are fundamentalists. A wife can refuse to consent to divorce, but it is easy to force her to consent. The Halacha decrees that disobedient wives can be declared moredet, rebellious, divorced against their will, and deprived of all rights, including those to property and child custody. A woman is moredet if she leaves her husband's home, has sexual relations with another man, refuses conjugal rights, or fails to provide domestic services. Ashkenazi women, in particular, are impoverished by divorce, allowed to keep only the gold teeth in their mouth, their wedding ring, and personal jewelry, if they have any. It is estimated that 10,000 agunot, the anchored, linger in limbo state in Israel, unable to obtain divorces because the man refuses his consent. Many live in extreme economic hardship. In the 1960s, women in some Israeli cities began spontaneously to organize women's groups. In 1974, Marcia Friedman was elected by an underground feminist vote, the single admitted feminist in the Knesset. Some of the few women parliamentarians were sympathetic to feminism, but too fearful to support it on all issues. The women's groups began to agitate for change, in one instance supporting a wildcat strike of women factory workers in major cities demanding equal pay. Friedman was hooted and booed when she proposed a law against wife battering. Jews did not batter their wives, she was told. Feminists had been demanding legal abortion since 1971. The Halacha prohibits abortion except to save a woman's life. Otherwise, abortion was illegal, yet was unofficially sanctioned for those who could pay for it. Most Israeli gynecologists ran private abortion clinics in their offices. performing about 45,000 abortions a year illegally and another 15,000 legally in hospitals, allegedly to save the mother's life. Friedman led an effort to legalize abortion, collecting signatures on a petition protesting at rabbinical court. In her account of her years in the Knesset, Exile in the Promised Land, she writes, "We demanded, rallied, petitioned, sat in, or marched. There were only a few of us, and angry crowds gathered. Israeli doctors physically assaulted her at a physicians' convention." Feminism spread as thousands of women joined women's groups and agitated on a number of fronts. Even Arab women began to speak out. I keep hearing things. If mainly among themselves. In 1975, at the end of International Women's Year, Friedman introduced a bill legalizing abortion, and Shulamit Aloni introduced an Equal Rights Act. Both bills raised havoc in the Knesset. Labor, not wanting to appear anti-women during International Women's Year, did not oppose the Equal Rights Act, knowing they could defeat it later. But its partner in the coalition government, the National Religious Party, was outraged, for a law to assert that the sexes were equal could open the door to civil marriage and the military drafting of their daughters. Equal rights threatened the Jewish family and therefore the Jewish state. The NRP threatened to leave the labor-led coalition, thereby toppling the government. The next morning, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin announced that the Equal Rights Act was dead. Despite enormous effort, the women's movement was unable to get a law legalizing abortion by choice, but a new bill was passed. Deferring to the desires of the dominant religious party in the gynecological establishment, who earned huge sums from illegal abortions, Knesset restricted abortions to rape and incest victims, single and menopausal women, teenagers, and the medically or mentally ill, with a poverty clause, a saif sociali, extending the right to poor mothers with large families. And at the end of the year, the government established the Prime Minister's Commission on the Status of Women in what Friedman calls the most significant, long-lasting result of the women's campaign. But as feminism grew, so did a nationalist Orthodox group, Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful. The Gush movement was founded by an Ashkenazi rabbi who believed Zionism was a prelude to the coming of the Messiah. And that the conquest and settlement of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, were a necessary precondition. In the mid-1970s, this small vocal group, risking their lives for their principles, began to settle in the West Bank and Gaza. With passion and tenacity, they set up campsites in the West Bank, dotting it with tiny Jewish enclaves. The land they settled had been claimed as military zones by the state or purchased by the Israeli Land Authority and did not legally belong to them. They threatened to resist removal, and the state hesitated. The military, without clear orders, refused to act. Gush Emunim is driven by religious fervor, like the zealots of the New Testament period. They are nationalist religious fanatics, unconcerned about the humanity of others, almost as if they don't exist, explains Leah Shakdeel, a religious feminist who left Gush and now supports the religious peace movement. Yet the Gush movement, is it Gush, has determined Israel's course in the last decades and for the foreseeable future. Its ideas and the fact that women were beginning to fight for themselves, to speak out, shifted Israeli men strongly to the political right. 2 years after the modified abortion bill was passed, the conservative party, Likud, was elected to power for the first time since Israel was founded. One of its first acts was to rescind the saif sociali, allowing poor women with large families to have legal abortions. The climate for Israeli feminists grows ever more hostile. Local religious councils, secular bodies that issue permits for all essential personal services, from marriage to burial, have been monopolized by religious parties that exclude women from membership. Shakdeel, elected to the council in Yeruham, was denied her seat and had to petition the High Court of Justice to obtain it. When Rina Shashua Hasson was chosen by several political parties to serve on the council for Ramat HaSharon in 1986. The rabbis refused to seat her on grounds that she was not strictly observant. Yet many men on the councils are secular Jews. She too petitioned the High Court, which referred the matter to the government, which dragged its feet for 2 years. In 1989, the parties replaced her with a male candidate. Women are in the forefront of the Israeli peace movement. They demonstrate and endanger themselves by making contact with Palestinian women. Like Iranians, Israeli men attack demonstrating women, hurling names and objects at them. In December 1989, Israeli, Palestinian, and European women joined together in a large peace march from west to east Jerusalem. When they entered a courtyard, someone raised a Palestinian flag. It is unclear whether the person was one of the marchers. The Palestinian flag is outlawed in Israel, and its raising allowed the police to become violent. They hit the women with sticks, kicked them, dragged them off by their hair, and fired tear gas at 3,000 nonviolent women marching for peace. The police claimed, oh my god, I'm getting so loud, that when they tried to remove the flag, they met resistance. The so-called Wailing Wall in Jerusalem is intersected by another at one end, thus. And there's like a T shape. The larger section, about 3/4 of the wall, is reserved for men, the remainder for women. Orthodox men will not worship beside a woman and post a man to stand guard, threatening any woman who even glances into their section. Women do not challenge this segregation, but on several occasions in 1989, groups of women trying to legitimate female worship marched to their own section of the wall wearing prayer shawls with a female rabbi carrying a Torah. Orthodox Jewish men insist women are forbidden to wear shawls and even to touch the Torah. Each time the women appeared, Hasidic men physically attacked them, paralleling the Muslims who physically attacked Iranian women marchers. They ran at the women, knocking them down. One hurled a heavy metal chair at their heads, wounding a woman in the neck. Israel, surrounded by enemies, has become an extremely militaristic state. Soldiers are everywhere, especially in Jerusalem, and males are exalted even more than before. During the 1990 to 1991 American-led war against Iraq, Israeli men were forced to sit on the sidelines. This triggered their machismo. Israeli feminist Alice Shalvi explains, they pulled female reporters from television news broadcasts, allowing only men to report and comment on the war, although women headed all political science departments at Israeli universities. But employers other than the television network demanded female workers appear. Knowing that schools and daycare centers were closed for almost 4 weeks, employers still threatened to dismiss women who did not come to work because their children were at home. When Iraq was sending missiles into Israel, all Israelis were ordered to stay home for 3 days. Then people returned to work, but hastened home in the late afternoon to the safe rooms women had sealed against a poison gas attack. But the rooms, Shalvi points out, were not safe for women. During this period, rape decreased on the streets, but reports of sexual assault within the home, incest, and sexual assault on minors rose dramatically, and the number of women who reported their husbands for beating them tripled. Okay. Gonna stop there. We can start our next video with Catholicism.